Welcome. Today we're going to finish the lesson on how to study the Bible. Last time we listed 7 hermeneutics, or rules for interpretation, to keep in mind. To review, here's the list again. Number 1, take the Bible for what it says. Number 2, let the Bible define and explain itself. Number 3, let the plain, straightforward, easy verses guide your understanding of the harder ones. Number 4, keep everything you read in its proper context. Number 5, don't make doctrine out of an historic account. Number 6, when an Old Testament verse is quoted in the New Testament, the context of that Old Testament verse must be brought into the New Testament passage for accurate understanding. And number 7, if you believe that every word is inspired, then treat it as such. In the last episode, we covered numbers 1 and 2 in detail, so let's move on now to the next one. Number 3 is let the plain, straightforward, easy verses guide your understanding of the harder ones. Let those plain spoken verses be your anchor when you're trying to figure out a more difficult one. There are so many examples I could use for this, but I'm going to pick a very obvious one. God in Isaiah 45:4 says, "For Jacob, my servant's sake, and Israel, mine elect." So this simple, clear definition of elect becomes our anchor. The first use principle also applies here because the first time we see the word elect in the Bible is in Isaiah 42:1, describing the descendants of Jacob, Israel. When we do a word search to see if this word gets redefined after this, no presuppositions allowed, we find that it does not and carries through the remainder of Scripture. So if God doesn't redefine it, should we? And what are we basing any redefinition on? Just what we've been told it means or want it to mean? If we accept the biblical definition, letting the Bible mean what it says, then that brings clarity and ease to so many passages, eliminating painful gymnastics and twisting the verses to fit a preconceived idea. Okay, on to the next one. Number 4, keep the verse in its context. Con means with, so context is with the text. Examine a verse in light of the verses before it and after it, as opposed to lifting it out to prove a point. In fact, I'd recommend never lifting a verse and applying it to anyone else other than the recipient God gave it to. Sometimes there are generalities or universals that can be applied, but you want to use extreme care in doing this. You can look for verses elsewhere that support your broader application, but don't rely on what you've always thought or been told. When considering context, always look at who the audience is, who is being spoken to, and what the bigger passage is about, what the author is trying to convey, why he's saying what he's saying. Again, using the letter analogy that I used in the last episode, have you ever written a comment that in context made perfect sense, but lifted out of context could cause trouble or misunderstandings? It's the same thing with the Bible. Stay true to context, which leads me to the next one. Number 5, don't make doctrine out of an historic account. A ridiculous example of this would be just because Peter cut off the ear of the Roman soldier doesn't mean we should make a doctrine for all believers to cut off the ears of military members. Or just because King David had many wives doesn't mean polygamy is our doctrine. Or at the end of Acts 2 and Acts 4, when the Jerusalem Jews sold all their possessions and lived communally in expectation of their messianic kingdom, those are not our instructions for how to live. In fact, later we see Paul has to take up an offering for them because it had become unsustainable. Paul even told the Thessalonians something that contradicted what was happening in Jerusalem. He said, if you don't work, you shouldn't eat. Number 6, when a verse is quoted, bring the context of that verse into the discussion where it is quoted. For example, in John 6:45, Jesus says, "It is written in the prophets, and they shall be all taught of God. Every man therefore that hath heard and hath learned of the Father cometh unto me." This comes from Isaiah 54:13, which says, "And all thy children shall be taught of the Lord." If you read this passage in Isaiah 54, you'll see that it's about Israel's inheritance, their promised messianic kingdom. Therefore, we know when Jesus said, "When every man who will have heard and learned of the Father will come unto Jesus," that he was referring to that future day when all know of God, when Jesus receives his messianic kingdom and throne. This is further confirmed in Jeremiah 31:31 through 34, which talks about when the new covenant is established with Israel, and there will be no need of teaching about God, because all will know him. And lastly, number 7. If you believe that every word is inspired, treat it that way. Respect each noun, preposition, verb, article, and pronoun. As Paul tells us in 2 Timothy 2:15, study to show thyself approved unto God, rightly dividing the word of truth. I'll tell you, sometimes this is not an easy task. In Paul's letters, for example, he may switch pronouns regularly. He'll be writing in first person plural, we, us, our, and then switch to second person, ye, you, and then back to first person plural. Ephesians is a great example of this. It requires some tracing back and careful study and cross-referencing to rightly divide these pronouns, identifying who a particular pronoun is referring to. If God was purposeful and intentional with every word, and I believe that he was, then we should be too. It would be kind of haphazard to just label Paul as a careless writer and assume all these pronouns mean the same thing. I think we're missing key ideas and creating lots of confusion when we do this. Well, I hope you'll put these principles into practice. I have found that the Bible can be trusted to mean what it says, and my prayer is that you will trust it too. See you next time.